Hello, everyone. So we are running this event non-stop 24 hours, and here we are with the 7th session of the day, and we have 5 more sessions to go. And this event is also streaming live on YouTube as well. If you are watching this stream on YouTube, links are available in chat window. You can come over to the Zoom and join directly from the Zoom. Then you'll have better interactivity with the speakers as well. And now we have Dr. V with us. Dr. V is a group program manager in Azure Data team, and he has decades of experience with database systems. And he has also authored a lot of books on Azure machine learning, predictive analytics, and a lot of other books. And Dr. V also holds a PhD degree in computer science from the National University of Singapore. And today, Dr. V is with us to talk about 7 things you should know about Azure Data Factory. So, Dr. V, the stage is all yours. Please take over.
Hey, sounds good. Okay, just want to make sure everyone can see the screen.
Yeah, we all can see the screen, yes.
So yeah, I think before we start, just one call out here is that the DPS 2020 runs round the clock, right? And as Satya was saying, right, it's 72 hours non-stop. And so thank you everyone for attending this. And what I understood from the organizer is that there's about 200 plus sessions, lots of training classes, right? And of course you get free recordings, and therefore definitely sign up for the DPS 2020 Summit as well, right? Now, so today's topic is 7 things you should know about the Azure Data Factory. And I'm part of the Azure Data Factory team, where I run a team of PMs, right, that's responsible for a lot of the things and that you see and love about Azure Data Factory. But I think before we get into the presentation proper, first of all, I think thank you to the community, right? Because without the community globally, Azure Data Factory will not be where it is today. And it has been maturing really, really nicely. And so thank you. And of course, in all these different languages, hopefully everyone will enjoy and learn something from this presentation as well. And so the agenda for today is really 7 things you should know about Azure Data Factory. And of course, some of this you might already have known. Some of this you might be not so obvious to you. And hopefully after this session, right, you gain a deeper understanding of the specific part of Azure Data Factory. And so we're going to cover all the 7 things. And hopefully this is going to be useful in your work as well as your various projects. So without further ado, let's get into the first one, which is, if many of you might have been following Azure Data Factory since its very early days when we birthed it on Azure. And to summarize, Azure Data Factory is really a fully managed serverless data integration service, right? That is not only easy to use, but it's also cost-effective, powerful, and intelligent, right? And if you look at Azure Data Factory today, and you log on to Azure, create an Azure Data Factory, and you start looking at the authoring tool that we provide, right? It is really enterprise data integration simplified. And what do we mean by that, right? And we're going to go into more details about this in the rest of the presentation. But before we get into that, I think one thing that I wanted to call out is that this pattern, which is known as the modern data warehouse pattern, is familiar to many people, right? Where you could already have on-premises data, whether it's Oracle, SQL, Teradata, files that's sitting on premises, some of these systems like SAP, etc. Or you could already have data that is either on Azure, or you could have data that is in AWS, GCP, or any of these third-party sources. Or you might even have SaaS set of data, like data that's coming from Salesforce and Dynamics, right? And the point about this modern data warehouse pattern is, regardless of where your data sources are, you want to be able to ingest them, and you want to be able to ingest them into a lake, such that then you can take it through this ingestion, preparation, transform, prediction, and enrichment kind of process. But more importantly, you want to be able to then serve this, because then through some of these insights that you get through landing this data not just in a lake, but serving it from an Azure Synapse SQL pool, for example, you will then be able to use Power BI to visualize it, right? And of course, Data Factory is there, helping you with both the orchestration part, monitoring of all this data pipeline that you would come to be dependent on in order to take it through this whole modern data warehouse flow, if you will. But more importantly, it also helps you bring data from all these different sources, right? So in one slide, I'm sure you've seen this multiple times, is by what we meant by enterprise data integration simplified is really 4 areas, right? One, which is, first, of course, it's very easy to use. Now, for those that are been with the SQL family for a while, you are familiar with SSIS, right? With that drag and drop interface and being able to not only drag and drop, but being able to run this at serverless scale, fully managed by the cloud, right? That allows you to scale your needs on demand. This becomes really, really powerful, right? And more importantly, I think a lot of the things that we've started looking into is how can we infuse more of this intelligence whenever you're doing data movement or when you're trying to define your data pipeline. And so we have started building a lot of capabilities into Data Factory underneath the hood that is transparent to you, but it's intelligently determining, you know, what region should we be placing an integration runtime so that you get the best performance, right? Or how should we be moving your data? How should we be firing up the machines that's powering Data Factory underneath the hood to enable you to be able to do transformation and data movement with the snap of a finger? And I think one of the things that also comes of it is today, organizations are not just doing data integration. More and more, there's been a lot of ask on, well, you know, what happens if I need to be able to do or build AI pipelines or predictive pipelines, right? But even before the beginning of inference, you need to transform the data and you need to move the data. And so Data Factory not only orchestrates your data movement, your transformation, but it also integrates very seamlessly with Azure Machine Learning and the code that you will have operationalized using Azure Machine Learning, and you will then be able to consume them within Azure Data Factory. Right, and of course, the next thing as well, you know, when you talk about data pipelines, you want to be able to monitor this, right? If something breaks, you want to be alerted to it. And so Data Factory do provide you with a whole set of monitoring experiences. And of course, in this case, you see us monitoring a data flow and the different stages of transformation that's happening in the data flow, right? And of course, if things do fail, and sometimes things do fail because it could be schema change, it could be, you know, the underlying data sources are not being able to, you're not able to connect to, etc. Then you want to be able to restate some of these pipeline activities and run them again. Data Factory enable you to do that really quickly, right? And so to put things in perspective, just to orientate some of you on the call that might be seeing Data Factory for the first time is, of course, you will build a data pipeline, right? And in a data pipeline, you could have different kind of activities. These activities could be invoking code that is running in Databricks cluster, like a notebook that's running on Databricks cluster, or it could be invoking a set of custom code that might be running on an Azure Batch cluster. Or you could be saying, well, an activity could be a copy activity where you need to copy data from your on-premises data sources to the cloud, etc. Right? And so within a pipeline, we also allow you to express constructs like iterations, right? For each thing, do this set of activities, right? And that is a kind of experience that many data integration users has come to love since SSIS days, right? Now, all this is now built into the Data Factory experience. So that is one set of concept. The other set of concept would be, well, if you're going to run all this pipeline, the pipeline needs to run somewhere. And so one of the things that we've done for you is to help you be able to do this in a serverless, but in a totally managed form, where you don't have to deal with all this complexity. We provide you with an Azure integration runtime, right? But more importantly, this Azure integration runtime can be sized up and down depending on your needs. But there are times when you could have your own set of data sources, whether it's on premises or you could have your set of data sources that's within a virtual network. And so in order to connect and reach back to your on-premises data, or your data sources that's sitting in a virtual network, we provide a self-hosted integration runtime, right? And then of course, this allows you to then be able to move data, be able to transform data and do useful things with the data, right? Regardless of whether it's in the cloud or on premises. Now, with that in mind, how do you go about specifying when this pipeline runs, right? Of course, you could do a schedule. And so we refer to that as a scheduled trigger. You could say, I want to run my pipeline at this specific day and time. Or you could say, well, I want to run this pipeline on demand just because you want to test it out, or because something has failed and you just want to run it one time or two times. We allow you to trigger it immediately. Or you could say, well, I really want to be able to state the kind of data dependencies and being able to specify a tumbling window kind of trigger. Now, we allow you to do that very easily in the UI, which you will see later. And one other common ask that we often get requests on is, well, what happens if I have data that's sitting in a blob storage? I want Data Factory to be triggered by new data that's dropped in a blob storage, right? And then being able to then start a pipeline to do something useful about it, right? And so, of course, we also support blob triggers as well as an event trigger. And so one thing that we often get asked is, underneath the hood, how does Azure Data Factory help you move this data at a global scale, right? And of course, today, just as a fun fact, Data Factory every single month globally move petabytes of data all around the globe, right? In some situation, the data needs to stay within a region because of various kinds of compliance that is needed. In some cases, data needs to be able to be copied from one part of an enterprise virtual network to another data store. And so Data Factory underneath the hood, when you use Data Factory, first, of course, when you want to do a copy, you specify what is known as the copy configuration setting. And here, this is when you say, well, how fast do you want to move the data, right? And if you want to move the data really fast, you will increase the DIU, or the data integration unit. By default, we put it as auto, meaning we will help you figure out how much DIU is needed to complete your task, your copy task in a reasonable time. Now, at the same time, you will also be able to configure the amount of copy parallelism, if you will. And so once you have specified this setting and you trigger the pipeline that's doing copy, in a just-in-time kind of manner, we will figure out what is the best way to run this, right? And from our pool of VMs that's available, we would then spin up something which is known as the Azure Integration Runtime, right? Which would then be spin up on demand, and you'll be able to copy at global scale. And of course, while this is copying, we realize that understanding how much data is copied, how much of DIU is being used, or even have a very systematic breakdown, right, of how much data gets moved, where are the bottlenecks. This becomes really useful, especially when you're troubleshooting performance issue. Now, all this set of information appear in the monitoring view. Now, the next thing that I wanted to call out as part of this first thing that you should know about Azure Data Factory, right, is really that Data Factory today, regardless of which part of the world you're in, right, is available, and is generally available in about 25 plus global region, and we continue to grow, right? All the way from South Africa North to US West. Wherever you need a Data Factory, we allow you to spin it as part of an Azure service. Now, the other thing that people often ask us about is really the fact that Data Factory is moving data and is applying transformation on the data. What kind of certification do you have from a security and compliance perspective, right? And today, of course, you could go to the Azure Trust Center, and you'll see that Data Factory today is actually certified for many of the major certification, right? From HIPAA all the way to ISO, or even to CSA star. And more importantly, when you connect to any of these data services, we allow you to either use a managed identity, right, or service principal. And for those that are in developing data factory pipelines, and you need to deal with all these credentials that connects to all these different data sources. Today, Data Factory allows you to store your credentials within the Azure Keyboard, right? And we integrate seamlessly with Azure Keyboard. Now, the other thing that's top of mind of everyone, which is one of the top asks, is, well, I have all these data sources. I do not want any of this data that belongs to my organization to be on the public internet. I want to make sure that my data integration is secure and is secure within my virtual network. But not only is it secure in my virtual network, when I'm connecting to any of these individual data sources, I'm connecting to it via a private endpoint. Now, and we understand that configuring a virtual network and at the same time trying to deal with that whole flow of connecting to these data sources using a private endpoint is not straightforward to configure if this is the first time you're doing it. And so Data Factory today in preview enable you to use this thing called a managed virtual network, or in short, managed VNets, right? That will then take care of spinning up this private endpoint for you on your behalf in your subscription. And then you will get an approval to say, well, for the respective store, or whether you allow this private endpoint to connect to your store. And of course, in this way, all the data move on the Microsoft network backbone. No data actually leave your secure boundary, right? And so this is how we look at security. Now, having said that, and hopefully at this point, you get a sense of what Azure Data Factory is. And you know, the next thing I wanted to share with you is, today you say, well, you know, you have a data integration tool, and this data integration tool, for it to be effective, needs to connect to all kinds of enterprise data, right? And of course, the second point, or the second thing I wanted to bring up to you is, just use Azure Data Factory to connect to all your enterprise data, and our goal and aspiration is to make it just work. And so what do we mean by that? Now, when we connect to all your enterprise data today, whether it's Azure Data Services, right, from Synapse Analytics, all the way to Azure SQL DB, Cosmos DB, storage, to data sources that are in competitive cloud, for example, right? We want to make it a seamless experience for you. And therefore, out of the box, Data Factory actually now provides about 90 plus built-in connectors, and the list continues to grow, that allows you to connect with these connectors. It allows you to ingest data from multi-cloud data sources, whether it's AWS, whether it's Google, whether it's on-premises data sources such as Teradata and Oracle. We just make it just work. Now, if you have data sitting in SaaS application like Salesforce, Macchiato, etc., we would also make it easy for you to connect to it. And therefore, just to put this in perspective, let me just show you a demo. And of course, this list of data sources is continuing to grow. What you're seeing now is Azure Data Factory, right? And of course, I'm going to create a pipeline. Now, after I created a pipeline, you'll see that, well, I say I want to copy data. Now, the moment I say I want to copy data, I would specify what is the data source. And so here you see the list, right, organized in a really, really easy to navigate way of all the data sources that we allow you to connect to. Now, after you specify a data source, for example, in this case here, you could select from all these different data sources. I would select one of this, right? Whether it's Azure Blob Storage, whether it's Cosmos DB, etc. And once I'm done, I will of course specify the corresponding destination. And with that, Data Factory already enable you to just copy data, right? With the snap of a finger. Now, the third thing I wanted to share with you today is the fact that in order for us to do data transformation, you often have several requirements. One is you want it to be easy for you to do all this data transformation where you don't write a single line of code, right? And for many of us that come from an SSIS days, you'll realize that drag and drop and being able to define a data flow is super important. Can you guys see the screen? Sorry, give me a moment. I think we dropped. Can y'all see the screen? Okay. And two, in order for you to be able to, after you define how do you want to do the transformation, another requirement is really the fact that I want to be able to then run this transformation at a scale that will allow me to transform the data at scale, right? And so, but I do not want to manage the infrastructure. And so the third thing I wanted to share with you today is really how Data Factory enable you to do code-free data transformation at scale, but most importantly, right, serverless. And so introducing to you the mapping data flow in Azure Data Factory, which is a way that we allow you to define a data flow, which we call a mapping data flow, using a graphical user interface, in this case, a UX, right? And so you spend your time defining how do you want to cleanse the data, how do you want to do the transformation, how do you want to aggregate the data, etc. And the moment you click run, let me just click this so you can see in action. The moment you click run, this graphical graph that defines your data transformation will then get compiled down to a domain-specific language, right? Which then allows us to execute this on a Spark infrastructure, right? At an infinite scale or at a cloud scale, if you will, right? And so right now, what you're seeing here, right, is really us starting a data flow, right? And in this case, if I double click on the data flow, you see that the data flow is going through different stages of transformation. In this case, from loading data from a fact table, setting some attribute, performing some lookup, if you will, right, etc. Now, the moment I click run, this is then going to be compiled down to a Spark infrastructure, and it's going to run at a scale, right, that allows you to do this data transformation, right, really quickly. And you could choose different kind of optimization strategy, meaning if I'm doing a lot of joins, maybe I want to run this on an infrastructure that is memory optimized, right? Or if I'm doing some compute intensive transformation, maybe I want to run this, right, on a compute infrastructure, right, that is compute optimized, if you will, right? And so by being able to separate your intent and what your data transformation intent is, right, and then being able to run this on an infrastructure that's best optimized for your transformation, we believe that then this will allow you to achieve data transformation that meets your enterprise needs really easily. Now, just to show that demo was a simple one, let me just show you certain things in practice, right? So today, for example, you could leverage the data flow to do data duplication, right? In this case, of course, you'll use this pattern if you want to eliminate common rows from your data, right? And you could even pick a heuristic to define what does it mean to do dedupe. You can tag rows, you can remove duplicate rows, right? And every single step or transformation that you see here is really configurable, right? And of course, you could even do things like exact matching or fuzzy matching, right? And so all these are now available to you, right, as sample pipeline, if you will, that will help accelerate, right, your development of data flow. Now, the other thing that's very common in the ETL space, right, is really how do you deal with slowly changing dimension, right? And slowly changing dimension is really a very common DW pattern, if you will, that manage changing attributes to different kinds of dimensions in your data. Again, you can graphically build a code-free SCD kind of ETL to load your data warehouse. Now, and to make it easy for you, we provide you with a template if you want to refer or you have something as a reference, right? And of course, here, you'll see that in this specific scenario, data flow provides you with a really rich set of transforms, from lookups to being able to do and work and assign a new surrogate key, to working with derived columns, or even simple things like being able to do selections, etc. And so again, with this with this serverless code-free data flow, if you will, we also allow you to do common things like loading data in the star schema, right? So here you see a very classic ETL pattern where you want to load a star schema into a data warehouse. And in this case, for example, again, you see a whole bunch of transformation, including aggregate transform, joins, etc., that allows you to land your data or load the data from your data lake straight direct into Azure SQL Synapse, if you will, right? Or Azure Synapse, if you will. Now, fuzzy lookups, when I was part of the SSIS team, this comes out a lot as well. And so today, using Data Factory, you can actually define different kind of fuzzy lookup rules. In this case, for example, we are using fuzzy lookup using a function called soundex, right, to match based on phonetic algorithms, if you will, right? And this is actually very useful in different kinds of scenarios where joins and lookups are against data that is not normalized or clean. Now, hopefully, this gives you a full or at least a glimpse into what are the kinds of things that you can do with mapping data flows. Now, the thing that comes up most often is as you're developing your data flow, you will want to be able to debug your data flow. And so today, using the interface, you can very easily enter into debug mode. You could quickly verify whether your logic is working using a really small interactive cluster, right? You will be able to understand, how data is flowing through different transformation in your data flow, if you will. And you will be able to run all this, again, using a really interactive Spark cluster that will spin up and down for you based on your needs. Now, at the same time, of course, you could preview the data at different stages of the data flow. Or if you want to be able to profile the data, right, which is also a common ask that I get, whether it's on the Data Factory team or when I was on the SSIS team earlier, right? We enable this out of the box, right, to understand the statistics about your data when you click on a column. Now, I think the question that many people will get, right, when I get to this point is, how do I jumpstart? Like, suppose I want to do SCD, or I want to do fuzzy lookup, or I want to do any of the other things that I showed you earlier. And so today, Data Factory provides you with a template gallery. And so in this case, I'm searching for SCD. And you saw that when I selected this template, all I need is to specify my block. In this case, the target being a SQL database. The moment I click Use Template, boom, the data flow gets created. If I double click on the data flow, you see that we have created all the steps, and therefore, hopefully, that will help you hook up your different transformation from source to transformation to sync really, really easily. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you is a lot of people will say, well, mapping data flows are great. Me being able to connect out my sources to the different kind of transformation and landing it in a sync or a destination is great. But I am familiar with the Power Query interface. And I've been spending some time learning how to use or do data wrangling using Power Query. And that is what I love and that is what I want. Can I do this in Data Factory? Now, it turns out that the answer is yes. And so today in Data Factory, when you say you want to create a data flow, we would ask you whether you want to create a mapping data flow, which is what you saw earlier, or a wrangling data flow. And when you select a wrangling data flow, again, you get your familiar Power Query interface in the Data Factory authoring experience. But after you have defined the kind of transformation that you want to do, right, using an interface that you love, which is the Power Query interface, we would then allow you to run this on the Spark infrastructure at scale, right? And therefore now you create your data flow using your favorite experience, the Power Query experience, but then you're able to define and run this data flow at a scale that would be the same, similar to if you have defined a mapping data flow. Now, the next thing I wanted to share with you is the fourth thing that I think you should know. is really how do you use Azure Data Factory to run any code that you have, right? Whether it's .NET code, whether it's Python code, or whether it's any kind of code that you have on any compute on Azure. And so Data Factory, besides the code-free experience, we also provide you with a code-centric experience, and it's really your choice. Now, in this case, of course, you could see that out of the box, you could leverage and run notebook, jar file, Python code in the Azure Databricks cluster if you choose to. Or you could run your high-peak Spark or MapReduce job, or even a Hadoop streaming job on the Azure HD Insight cluster. Or if you just want to invoke some logic that you have, right, within a Synapse SQL pool or Azure SQL DB or SQL Server, we allow you to do that using a stored procedure. Or as I was sharing with you earlier when we started this presentation, if I want to leverage Azure Machine Learning, right, and the kind of APIs that has been operationalized in Azure Machine Learning workspace, we integrate seamlessly with Azure Machine Learning. Now, other things that we see a lot of usage on is a lot of people write code that allows them to connect to different things, extensions, if you will, using Azure function, but then they orchestrate this as part of Azure Data Factory. Right, and of course, last but not least, if you just want to run this at scale on the Azure Batch cluster that auto scales for you, we also allow you to run code in an Azure Batch cluster. Now, the fifth thing I wanted to share with you today, which I think if there are people in the audience, right, where you come from an SSIS world, and within your organization, you have already built lots of SSIS package. I still remember the time when I was on the SSIS team, and we work with customers globally on the SSIS packages that they have. Now they say, well, you know, you guys came out of Azure Data Factory. What is going to happen to my SSIS package? Can I run SSIS packages on ADF? Right? Can I take advantage of the SSIS catalog for managing some of the SSIS packages and continue having the experience? But can I just run it on SSIS as it is without any transformation? Right? And it turns out that yes, you can. Today, you can run it on ADF using SSIS integration runtime. And our goal there is it will just work. Now, of course, if you're connecting to on-premises file system, etc., you still have to, if you did not parameterize it correctly, you will need to parameterize it, right? And since SSIS 2012, we introduced a really rich set of parameterization that you can do on SSIS package. And so we wanted to say, well, you know, SSIS and ADF, it just works, right? And of course, one is you no longer need to maintain your on-premises SSIS infrastructure. You are now able to then deploy SSIS packages in the cloud, but be able to leverage Azure Data Factory, where SSIS and Azure Data Factory is just one thing. That is one. But two is, once this is in Azure Data Factory, where you're able to run, say, thousands or lots of SSIS packages at your on-premises in the cloud, you might start wanting to also start modernizing your data integration flow, if you will, right? And so with that, you would then be able to do this using Data Factory. And so you are able to mix and match, right, whatever that you have in SSIS and start modernizing this using Azure Data Factory. Now, how does this work? One is the moment you start bringing your SSIS package and running them in Azure Data Factory, you would then be able to take advantage of everything that you come to know and love about Azure Data Factory. But more importantly, it helps you in cost saving as well, right? Through some of these Azure hybrid benefits that's available, right? It actually allows you to lower your overall total cost of ownership. But not only that, many people ask, you know, once this is on Azure, or my SSIS packages might be using a lot of these custom components that are not out of the box that I have bought over the years. Can I use them? Or is it just a subset? It turns out the answer is yes. Any kind of SSIS components that you have bought, you would then be able to install this on your SSIS integration runtime, and Azure Data Factory will just be able to run it like that, just like that, right? And so what you see here is really the fact that now that you have your SSIS packages running in the cloud, you're now able to mix and match your SSIS package with a web activity. Or you could then say, well, you know, I'm going to start off with my SSIS package that's going to land data, say in a SQL Server or Azure SQL database. But then I'm going to modernize it with additional pipelines, right, that transform the data, that gets the data into the right shape. And in this case, of course, you could start building it using Azure Data Factory and all the things that comes with it. Right. And early on, as I was sharing with you, we work very closely with a lot of this Microsoft partner, many of that might be familiar to the SSIS community, right, on optimizing your data factory setup, all right, for SSIS custom components. Okay. Now, the sixth thing that I wanted to share today is really data ops and Azure Data Factory. Now, as you start building your data pipelines, and in your data pipeline, you could have a copy activity, or you could have a data flow, etc. You will then say, well, you know, I really want to be able to check in all my code into a source code repository, right? Like Azure DevOps or a Git repo. How do I do that using Azure Data Factory? That's the first thing. Second is, I want to be able to do diff and merge. I want to be able to do code review of all these data pipelines to understand what has been changed. Was it a timeout setting that has been changed? Was it a copy data source that has been changed, etc.? Right. And so today, conceptually, you might have different Git repo, and this could be a GitHub, this could be Azure DevOps Git repo, and you have different projects, right? And for each one of this project, you really want to take it through the whole entire life cycle, right, of a development factory, a test factory, and a production factory. And so today, in Data Factory, we allow you to associate, right, your Data Factory against either an Azure DevOps Git repo or a GitHub Git repo, right? And so this then also allows you to separate and leverage some of this granular RBAC or role-based access control capabilities to resources within factories, right, to the different groups of people, right? Whether it's the infrastructure team, whether it's a site reliability engineering or the operation team who is looking at monitoring, rerunning, or debugging on the pipeline, or the data engineering team that's responsible, right, for deploying the pipeline. Now, to show you this in action, right, you see here is Data Factory. We set up a Git repo. We select whether it's Azure DevOps or Git. And this connects seamlessly with AAD. We select the DevOps account. We select the project that you saw earlier. And we say, well, maybe I want to create a new Git repo. I want to use an existing one. In this case, I'm creating one called ADF demo repo. Once this is done, the Data Factory that you see here and that you're authoring here is now connected to the repo, meaning you could submit pull requests. Someone could use Azure DevOps to approve of your pull request, and you could leverage Data Factory deployment as part of your overall CI/CD process. Now, here we're creating an empty factory, an empty pipeline, if you will, but you'll see that we are publishing, right? And so the moment I'm publishing, it's going to say, well, you know, do you want to merge this with master? And here you see us logging into Azure DevOps and say, well, let's create a pull request. Someone gets the pull request, they would then go ahead to approve the pull request. Now, once this is done, this can be part of your pipelines, right, in order to then deploy incremental parts of Data Factory to Azure. And of course, by integrating this Git experience directly into the place where you develop your pipeline, we hope to provide you with some source control capability. You could use Azure DevOps or GitHub. But more importantly, it allows you to automate the deployment of a data factory where you could have developed a data factory and tested all your pipeline using dev data or development data. Move this through its different stages from test to then finally production using Azure pipelines. Now, one of the things we note is that you could be creating very complex data factory pipelines, and this could result in huge JSON files that might not be deployable. And so what we did is to then, as we create this template that is used for deployment as part of a CI/CD process, we would also automatically generate what we call link resource manager template so that your large factory can be broken down into smaller parts that will make it easier to deploy. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk to you, which is the last thing, and we often say that, well, we're going to leave the last thing for the last, right? Or the best thing for the last, if you will, is really this notion of, well, you know, I want to be able to do data integration, but I want to do my data integration in a secure way where data do not get exposed or exfiltrated on the public internet. I want this to just happen within my virtual network. And so this is something that is currently in preview, but we already have a lot of customer uptake on this. Is really how can we do secure data integration with a managed VNet? And so here, the managed VNet really have a few parts to it. One is in Azure Data Factory, when you create the factory, you would see an option that says, do you want to create a managed VNet? Now, the moment you say yes, underneath the hood, without you having to deal with all this complex networking setup, etc., we would create and manage a virtual network for you. And of course, you could monitor this virtual network within your data factory monitoring hub, right? But not only do we create the managed virtual network, we will make sure that we inject the Azure integration runtime so that it only operates within the security boundary of this managed virtual network that belongs to you. Now, after all this is done, we would also create what we call ADF managed private endpoints. And what are these, right? These are essentially endpoints that are created. And so whether it's Azure Storage or whether it's Azure Synapse Analytics, if you will, you would then get an approval request on whether you allow this managed private endpoint to connect to you. And so you have an approval workflow that allows you to approve or decline. And once you have done all this, whenever we do data integration, whether it's data movement or when you're running your data flows, we would run this securely within this managed virtual network where data, right, is kept all on the Microsoft backbone. And hopefully with that, right, this is one promise that we have to customers, is that then this allows you to protect against situations of data exfiltration because we ensure that the traffic between your data stores and the managed virtual network all happens within the Microsoft backbone. Right, and so this feature right now is in preview. We encourage everyone to try it. Now, last but not least is how do I get started with Azure Data Factory? Now, in this case, of course, visit our Azure Data Factory documentation page that provides you with a lot of how-tos and references. But the other thing that we've done just about a month ago is we realized that many of us want to learn about Azure Data Factory. But more importantly, we want to be able to have a learning path that allows me to progress at my own pace. And so one of the things that we have created, right, is really, which is a collaboration with the Azure Learn team or the Microsoft Learn team, is a set of data factory modules, if you will. Just about a month ago, we released 3 modules, right, that allows you to learn different parts of data factory, right, from how do you copy data from different data sources, all the way to how do you go about creating your first mapping data flow. Now, the other thing that we have been doing a lot and we are continued strive towards, right, is engaging with the technical community. And so we really encourage everyone to watch out for our Twitter, AZ Data Factory. And we also maintain the YouTube channel that every single week would have new videos, right, that tells you about how do you do certain things with the data factory. And hopefully through all this effort and through engaging the technical community, we would be able to, one, right, work with you in order to mature and grow data factory and take it to the next level. But more importantly, we believe that working in the community would also allow you to get to know the engineering team much better. And so in summary, today I shared with you 7 things that you should know about Azure Data Factory, right? We started off with why is Azure Data Factory an enterprise-ready serverless data integration service? And how do we do this at scale, right? We shared with you some nuggets into how do we move data globally at an unprecedented scale. But then we move on to talk and share with you on how does Azure Data Factory allow you to connect to any enterprise data sources where it just works, right? Whether it's on premises, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's a SaaS kind of application. 3, we shared with you, if you're going to do data transformation, how do you do this without writing a single line of code? But more importantly, after you've defined what your data transformation will be, how do we allow you to run this serverless, meaning you don't need to manage or worry about the infrastructure? But at the same time, be able to monitor this, different parts of this transformation, right? So that you get visibility into what is happening and be able to debug if it's needed. Now, the 4th thing we shared with you is, besides all of this, and you choose a code-centric or code-first approach, whether you wrote some Python code or you wrote some .NET code, and you want to integrate this as part of your whole data integration flow, if you will, we allow you to run your code on almost any compute on Azure, right? From Azure Functions to Azure HD Insight Cluster to Azure Databricks, and many, many more. And 5th, we make it really easy for any person that have SSIS experience to leverage Azure Data Factory. Most importantly, we want to ensure that all your SSIS package, even if it use custom component, to just work. But after it works and it runs on Azure Data Factory and we help you manage the whole infrastructure of spinning up the SSIS integration runtime, we want to work with you to be able to then modernize some of this into Azure Data Factory data flows or Azure Data Factory pipelines. Now, 6, we share with you something which is key to any kind of enterprise adoption of a data integration tool, which is how do we allow you to be able to attach Data Factory with a source control, whether it is Azure GitHub, Azure DevOps, or whether it's GitHub, right? And be able to then do CI/CD as part of your Azure pipelines. Now, last but not least, we shared with you how you could achieve and make sure that your data stays secure and is moved securely within a secure boundary. That notion of how do you do secure data integration with a managed virtual network. And so hopefully these 7 things will be something that's useful to you as you start to get to know Azure Data Factory. And hopefully you will leverage the resources that were provided you earlier. Right, and stay connected with us. Now, finally, I think, thank you for your time. You see some of the Twitter channels, right, for SQL Server Geeks, Data Geeks. At the same time, we also shared with you the Twitter for Data Factory, where we continuously tweet about some of the achievements and videos or conferences that the community is engaging in, but also share with you some of the latest news that we feel is really exciting about Data Factory, and we wanted everyone to know about it, right? And of course, we provide a whole set of videos that we release almost on a weekly basis, right, to share with everyone how do you achieve specific tasks in Azure Data Factory. Now, I think with that, thank you. Thank you everyone for your time. We know it's tough going through a 24 hours conference, including the organizers. We've been staying up late. But we say thank you to the community for working with us to grow Azure Data Factory. And I think together we can take Azure Data Factory to its next level. Thank you everyone, and back to the organizers.
Thank you very much, Wee, for your time. It was a real pleasure hosting you. I mean, we should thank you because speakers make us who we are, including the attendees. So there are a few questions, I guess, in the Q&A panel. Would you just look at the Q&A panel?
Sure. So I'm looking at the, is it chat or Q&A? Q&A, okay, got it. Okay, I think let me look through the question. I think the first question is, what is the difference between DIU versus the degree of copy parallelism? So DIU would actually define or determine the kind of infrastructure that we put underneath the hood and the number of nodes that we use to do the copy, right? The parallelism means at any point in time, and it depends on the characteristic of the data source and destination, how many copies of it can we initiate at one time, right? And so it's usually a combination of DIU and copy parallelism that will enable you to be able to run your copy job really quickly. Now, the next question is, how does ADF compare to the likes of Talend, Medallion, etc.? And then, of course, the second question is it lift and shift from SSIS to ADF? And everything magically just works. So let me take the first one. I think we believe ADF is one of the best data or enterprise data integration tool out there in the market. And today, ADF is not only able to allow you to achieve hybrid data integration at a serverless scale, but more importantly, the ability for us to even run this on a Spark infrastructure without you worrying about it or leveraging things like managed private VNets, if you will, right? These are enterprise-ready capabilities that we don't see some of these other vendors having, right? And so, of course, we believe that ADF would meet most of your needs as the data integration tool that's available on Azure. And then the second question is, can I just take any SSIS package, if I may paraphrase, and just run on ADF and it just work? It turns out that you can, because we want to make sure that there's no gotchas to say, oh, wow, it does not work because I have a SSIS custom component, if you will, etc., etc. And so we make sure as part of the design process, by design, that it should just work when you run any SSIS package. Now, the only situation and few customer situations where we see it does not work is because in your SSIS package, you might be relying on some local path, file path, if you will, or the local file system that you have not parameterized, right? And of course, in SSIS 2012, you see that we've introduced this notion of parameters for your packages, if you will. And so if you have a parameterized it correctly, and when you move lift and shift up to ADF and you change it to your Azure location, if you will, then it should just work, right? Now, the question is, can you use ADF when both source and target are on premises? Right, today, yes, right, because in order for you to use ADF on premises, you will install a self-hosted integration runtime, right? And therefore, you could easily say, well, in this hosted integration runtime, you want to move data from, say, an Oracle database into a SQL server, right? And so that should just work. Now, the next question that's up there is, does it support all components in SSIS? Do you have script component in VC, right? Or VB? What about checkpoint, error handling, etc.? And then, of course, the second question is, can you do hybrid ADF with on-premises? Now, for the second question, maybe you want to elaborate on what do you mean by hybrid ADF on premises while I answer the first question. So SSIS out of the box comes with all these built-in components. Those will just work. Now, if you use components, for example, from Cozy Rock, or say, for example, components from Pragmatic Works or any of these other partners, if you will see that in the documentation, we'll share with you how do you install these components on the SSIS integration runtime. And once you've installed this component, it should just work. Now, the question on what about checkpoint, error handling, etc. Now, we don't expect any SSIS functionality to not work because today, whether you define a checkpoint and error handling, right, in SSIS, this checkpoint and handling will get saved. I think one of the areas, of course, we wanted to improve further on is to make sure that after the checkpoints or error handling code fires, right, you're able to get the data. Now, when we fire up the SSIS integration runtime, you get everything that you expect of SSIS, right? So any SSIS capability will just work. Now, I think the last question, which is, can you do hybrid ADF with on-premises? Maybe the attendee will want to elaborate on it and what you mean by that. Any other questions?
All right, friends, time to see if there are other questions, and maybe Anaswamy can elaborate the question a little more. Right, I think that's where it is. We have no more questions.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, for your time. It was a real pleasure hosting you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Yeah, have a good rest of the day.
And see you and host you in Data Platform Summit.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.